Louisiana. She's the exception and never the rule. She's a mystery that asks not to be solved, but simply to be experienced. Louisiana, where you can come as you are and leave different. Additional funding is provided by the Friends of Louisiana Public Broadcasting and the Foundation for Excellence in Louisiana Public Broadcasting.
This is the story of the Cajun people of Louisiana. It's a story that begins nearly 400 years ago, when French peasant farmers left Europe to carve a new homeland in the wilderness of Nova Scotia. After a brutal ethnic cleansing, the ancestors of the Cajun people were scattered around the world. They were able to end their exile and reunite their families here in Louisiana. People would have been brought down to this area, and this dry creek would have contained water, and they were loaded into the boats and brought down to the Minas Basin, where they would have been loaded on the transports and taken away from their homeland forever. European settlers came to this place over 400 years ago. It's amongst the most fertile and beautiful farmland in all of North America. Today it's called Nova Scotia. But to the original French settlers, this place was called l'Acadie. In 1604, 16 years before the Mayflower Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, French colonists came to Acadie and established one of the first permanent European communities in North America. Acadie's early years were precarious, but beginning in 1632, the first families began to arrive at the Port Royal settlement. Over the next 20 years, some 60 families came to make Acadie their home. These were the ancestors of nearly all the Acadian peoples of Canada and Louisiana today.
These people already knew each other. Somewhere around 60% or so of the people who became the Acadians came from the same neighborhood, from around a 20-mile radius around one little town in northern Poitou. They already knew each other. They already had a sense of identity, a sense of community, a sense of society. And essentially, this little society was uplifted and boated over to what we now call Nova Scotia, what they called l'Acadie, after the name that the Micmac Indians used to call the place.
The colony grew rapidly, spreading outward from Port Royal to Grand Pré, the Minas Basin, Beaubassin, and Chignecto. Small families expanded into large clans. These clans formed the base of Acadian society.
The family was so important for those people that there couldn't be a country, there couldn't be a people if there was not basically the groups of families that were all related to one another. So they kept on helping each other to survive. For instance, if one man named Cormier would die, then the Leblanc would take over the kids, but keep the name Cormier so that the descendant of that man would know where they came from.
From the early start of the 17th century, when Acadia appears on the map as a small French colony, the French inhabitants that later on would be known as Acadians really had no choice but to take care of their own affairs. France was far away. The major French settlement in the area was also far away in the St. Lawrence Valley, which is now Quebec.
The Acadians, or at least the colonists, French colonists who colonized the Bay of Fundy Basin, were refugees from the very bloody, very intense religious civil war that plagued France for almost a century, from the early to mid 1500s up until and culminating in 1628 with the fall of La Rochelle. Much of the warfare, much of the worst fighting took place in northwestern Poitou province. And the Acadians, who were peasants in that area, were caught in a military crossfire.
As generations passed, memories of the mother country began to fade. Isolated from France, the Acadians began to think of themselves as an independent people, evolving a culture and a way of life uniquely their own, developing a distinctly North American mentality.
The Acadians were the first group of European settlers in the New World to use a name for themselves that no longer had anything to do with the Old World. They were profoundly North American. They were what my colleague Mate Alain refers to as Homo Americanus, the first example, in fact, of that new species.
Work was done as a community, whether it was building their homes, harvesting crops, even holding back the encroaching seas. Through an elaborate system of dikes and sluices, les aboiteaux, the Acadians reclaimed over 13,000 acres of saltwater marsh and turned it into the richest farmland in America.
French Acadia was mostly in what is now Nova Scotia, around the Bay of Fundy. There is where you would have found the great majority of Acadian villages. And the great majority of the inhabitants of those villages were farmers. And they put together sort of a very original way to share croplands by building dikes, sort of to take from the sea a special kind of harvest. And in French, they would call these systems aboiteaux. This made them very prosperous farmers that had to work together because at low tide they could work in the fields, but if the tides, especially the tides of the Bay and Fundy, which are one of the highest in the world, when the big tides would come in, they would have to fight the tides away by building these dikes.
But it was not just the sea that was threatening Acadie. The Acadians had built a prosperous, independent homeland. Fish and game were abundant, their orchards were bountiful, trade with their neighbors was lucrative. Epidemics like smallpox, typhoid, and cholera were unknown in Acadie. They lived as well or better than anyone else in North America. But what the Acadians had, others would soon try to take away.
This is the Minas Basin.
And how many families are in Chignecto?
200 families, sir.
And how many families in Cobequid?
Cobequid.
and continue the burning. Sergeant!
Less than 10 years into the colony's existence, Port Royal was burned to the ground by English forces from Virginia. This was only the beginning. The French and British were trading pawns in a deadly game for the possession of North America, with Acadie as the key strategic prize. The colony had changed hands 10 times in the first 100 years of its history before finally being ceded to the British in 1713. It was an uneasy peace, the French ready to retake Acadie, or Nova Scotia as the British called it. The Acadians, however, did not care about the color of the flag that floated over the governor's house.
The Acadians had learned over the years that for a while they might belong to France, and for a while they might belong to England, and then they would return to France, and then they would return to England. They had learned by that experience to not place a whole lot of stock in who owned the colony at any given moment. While they belonged to, during the periods they belonged to England, they didn't stop trading with New France, and during the periods that they belonged to France, they didn't stop trading with New England.
When the British took control of Nova Scotia, many of them wanted to get rid of the Acadians altogether, but they couldn't. Not just yet, anyway.
The British weren't able to expel the Acadians in 1713 simply because they were dependent upon the Acadians for their source of supply. Acadia was a backwater outpost outside of the main shipping lanes which went to Boston and Quebec. And as a consequence, the cost of maintaining a garrison from either Boston or London would have been extremely high.
So by threats and empty promises, the British spent the next several decades trying to assimilate the Acadians. Each successive governor of Nova Scotia would try to force the Acadians to swear the oath of allegiance to the British crown unconditionally, and always they would refuse.
They learned to be very independent, fiercely independent, and to sort of disregard institutional authority from afar.
Throughout their negotiations with the British, the Acadians insisted on 3 fundamental conditions: the unrestricted right to practice their Catholic religion, full ownership of their land and property, and the exemption from having to bear arms.
They weren't as reluctant to simply pledge allegiance to the British, but they were reluctant to accept all of the factors that came along with that. One of them was that they were going to have to stop speaking French and learn English. Another was that they were likely going to have to change religions. And the most important one, the Acadians, if they were anything, they were profoundly pragmatic. The most important one was that if they became English subjects, they would have to accept to fight against the enemies of the British, which meant that they were going to have to fight against the Micmac Indians who had helped them establish themselves there and with whom they had wonderful relations. And they were going to have to accept to fight against the French.
Attempts to assimilate the Acadians had failed, and the military situation was growing increasingly tense as England and France prepared for yet another war. The neutral Acadians found themselves living between 2 heavily armed and hostile camps.
It's essentially a flashpoint. It's one of those areas where the 2 empires come into direct contact, and it's also where military force is brought to bear right on the common boundary line. And it's as a result of this that the area's importance is magnified, especially where the Acadian population was concerned.
It's important to understand when considering this business of the oath of allegiance that people often ask, why did the Acadians not sign the oath of allegiance? Why they didn't accept it? Well, the British governors were being very careful for a long time, and it's documented that they didn't want the Acadians to take that oath of allegiance. They didn't want to deal with that because they didn't want, they were trying to hold off and stave off enough time and not press this issue so that they didn't get the Acadians, getting a bunch of Acadians jumping across the line and going to help the French before the English were well enough established to be able to resist that kind of attack. And it wasn't until Lawrence got there that they finally felt like they had the numbers to protect the colony, and that's when they started to press it. But even then, Lawrence said in several letters, you know, I will present to them one last time the oath of allegiance, and they will not sign this, but I will use as a pretext that they had refused it before to not let them sign it. And if they don't sign it, I shall deport them. And if they should figure out a way to accept the terms and sign it, I will deport them anyway. No matter what they did, whether they accepted or not, the plan had already been set into motion to rid the colony of these people.
His solution was nothing less than a complete ethnic cleansing of the country.
Thomas.
In a plan masterminded by Governor William Shirley of Massachusetts, infamous in his hatred for the French, Lawrence took command of 2,000 volunteer soldiers. They confiscated the Acadians' firearms and their boats, effectively neutralizing them as a military force. Still, the Acadians refused to sign the unconditional oath. On September 5th, 1755, the men of Grand Pre were ordered to report to their church for negotiations. It was a trap. Once inside, the men and boys were taken prisoner. The soldiers announced that the Acadians would forfeit their lands to the British Crown and be deported. For days, their wives and children waited at home. Some would never see their families again. This was the beginning of Le Grand Dérangement. Before it was over, Acadie would be destroyed. Many Acadians fled into hiding, and over 6,000 of them would be transported by force and scattered throughout the British North American colonies.
The British found themselves in the untenable position of being in political control of a colony they didn't actually own. The Acadians had been there for about 100 years, and they had not settled the worst lands. They were on the best lands. And British families that were coming in to settle the colony were having to go out and clear the woods and the rocks. And that wasn't acceptable to the British government. So what they did very simply was basically boat lift everybody off those lands so that they could put good British subjects on them.
Things are now very heavy on my heart and hands. It hurts me to hear their weeping. I'm in hopes our affairs will soon put on another face, and I rid of the worst piece of service yet ever I was in. John Winslow.
You will use all the means proper and necessary for collecting the people together so as to get them on board. If you find that fair means will not do with them, you must proceed by the most vigorous measures possible, not only in compelling them to embark, but in depriving those who shall escape of all means of shelter or support, by burning their houses and destroying everything that may afford them the means of subsistence in the country. By order, Major Charles Lawrence.
It's not every Acadian that passively resisted the deportation and accepted it with quiet resignation as the stereotype has often been presented. There were some, they were a minority, yes, but there were nevertheless some for whom this exercise was completely unbearable, and they preferred taking refuge in the woods, living with the native people of the area, and actively resisting all the incursions that the British soldiers would later inflict upon them. It was under the leadership of a Joseph Brossard that was nicknamed Beausoleil.
Broussard de Beausoleil was a very hard-headed and stubborn Acadian. We know this of him because he was implicated in a few trials during the British regime in Nova Scotia. He spent many years with Mi'kmaq warriors attacking some British garrison. He was protected by well-connected Acadian uncles and cousins who dealt sort of on a daily basis with the British officials, but they never trusted Beausoleil. Beausoleil was known to have fights with Acadian men. He was accused of being the father of a child out of wedlock.
Beausoleil Broussard was the leader of the Acadian resistance, but in the end, facing the imminent starvation of his family, even he was obliged to lay down his arms and surrender. Beausoleil spent the remainder of the war a prisoner of the British. Locked in the cargo holds of the prison ships, there was no sanitation, no sunlight, not even room to move. Many of the exiles would die of hunger and disease before they ever saw land. The Acadians were scattered throughout the American colonies.